Saint Augustine. If a parricide is more wicked than anyone who commits homicide, because he kills not merely a man, but a near relative, without doubt worse still is he who kills himself, because there is none nearer to a man than himself. Violette Nozière, born on January 11th of 1915, was a French woman who was convicted of murdering her father and attempting to murder her mother as well. Violette Nozière was a bright child who gradually became wayward. Being the only child of a lower middle-class bourgeois family, her father's employment afforded her attendance at the prestigious Lycée Fénelon, an all-girls school in Paris, France. And despite getting good grades and having good behavior at school, she started skipping often, trading daily attendance at school to hang out at the Quartier Latin, a district that was a hot spot for the youth, the Latin Quarter. As a young woman, she was indulged and supplemented her allowance with occasional prostitution. Violette Nozière's negative behavior was increasing, and at the age of 16, she began to not only drink and date many older men, she would go on to pose nude for money. People that knew and were familiar with Violette Nozière would say how she would oftentimes tell them stories, exaggerating things like her father's job and her family's proximity to power. In 1933, Violette Nozière lived at 9 Rue de Madagascar in the 12th arrondissement, Paris, France, where they lived in a very small 2-room apartment. Her father was Jean-Baptiste Nozière, and her mother was Germaine Nozière. Her father, Jean-Baptiste Nozière, worked for PLM as a train driver. That stands for Paris-Lyon-Marseille. PLM was one of the largest railways throughout all of France in the 1930s. It single-handedly was responsible for creating the tourism to Versailles, to the Mediterranean, and to other places in and outside of France and Eastern Europe. Jean-Baptiste Nozière made a decent living as a train driver. However, the family was still lower middle class, despite the fact that Jean-Baptiste was the driver of the train for the president of France for many years. This employment not only afforded Jean-Baptiste Nozière a comfortable life for he and his stay-at-home wife, Germaine, but it allowed him to give his only child, Violette Nozière, the education that she received, as well as a weekly allowance. March 1933, 18-year-old Violette Nozière attempted to poison her parents with an insufficient dose of barbiturates. However, in August of 1933, she poisoned them again. Wednesday, August 23rd of 1933 at 2 a.m., René Mayol hears an insistent knocking on his 5th floor apartment. Awoken from a deep sleep, he finds his neighbor from the 6th floor, Violette Nozière, in the corridor, panicking. She tells him, "Come quick, there's gas in my parents' apartment." René then goes into the apartment, not lighting any lights, opens a window to ventilate the apartment, goes into the kitchen, turns the gas off at the source. After airing it out, he turns on a light to find a horror scene. Germaine Nozière lay on a bed covered in blood. Violette turned so ill that René takes her to his apartment to then go to concierge to Madame Bourdon to use her phone to then call the authorities. Firemen are the first on the scene, where they find Jean-Baptiste in the living room on Violette's bed, covered in blood and vomit. Soaked in blood, Jean-Baptiste Nozière is deceased. Germaine Nozière, however, is still breathing and barely clinging to life, where they rush her straight to Saint Antoine Hospital. Captain Goudet arrives at the scene and suspects suicide by gas, and that's largely because Violette Nozière was saying things like, "Why would they do this? Why would they kill themselves? My parents would never do this." Captain Goudet was suspicious, and he had every right to be. Finding Germaine Nozière's account book, it stops at Monday, August 21st. and she was known to record every day. Captain Goudet would go and read the gas meter, proving that very little gas had actually been used, considering that Jean-Baptiste had lied deceased for over 12 hours. Baptiste and Germaine Nozière could not have been the ones to turn the gas on. Among the evidence collected, he also finds a letter to Monsieur Jean Dabin. With all of his doubts and evidence, Captain Goudet asks Violette Nozière to come to the police station at 3 p.m., where he will then take her to the hospital to see her mother, because she was still alive, although she was still in a light coma. Captain Goudet seats Violette Nozière in the guard's office and tells her to wait there while he goes in to speak to her mother first. Captain Goudet is met with a physician who says that he can speak to Madame Nozière, but she still cannot speak after coming out of the coma. Captain Goudet goes in to speak to Germaine Nozière, and when he comes back 5 minutes later, he finds that Violette Nozière had fled. Germaine tells a very disturbing tale of how, on Monday night after dinner, their daughter Violette Nozière had 3 packets of medicine, supposedly from the family doctor, to cure a hereditary syphilis disease. Despite being a lie, Germaine and Baptiste believe it to be true. 3 little packets were pulled out by Violette, one with an X for her. Germaine also recalls that she and her husband drank theirs. However, she only drank half, which would end up saving her life. After sending blood and vomit samples to the toxicology laboratory, it came back that there was no carbon monoxide in the blood of Jean-Baptiste Nozière or his wife, Germaine Nozière. However, their blood did come back positive for very high levels of Veronal. Veronal is the very first form of barbital that would come from the pharmaceutical market and hit the streets of Europe, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and even the United States. It single-handedly is responsible for thousands of homicides and overdoses from the 1930s to the mid-1950s. In over 15 countries worldwide. It was very expensive, and it was oftentimes hard to get your hands on it. Veronal would go on to claim many lives, including the homosexual wealthy aristocrat Hugh-Eric Trevanion. But this pharmaceutical drug would also be at the heart of many homicide cases, including that of flamboyant Auckland musician Eric Morillo and his 5th wife, Thelma. After catching his 5th wife, Thelma Morillo, in bed with another woman, he took her life and was twice convicted and sentenced to death. So how did young 18-year-old Violette Nozière get her hands on it? Despite Violette posing as an upstanding student, she was actually told by the principal of Lycée Fénelon that she couldn't come back the following year. And in the confines of her tiny 2-room apartment shared with her mother and father, she would slip out after dark to subsidize her escapades in the Paris Latin Quarter with occasional sex work. She fell in love with Jean Dabin, a gambler with expensive tastes, promising to pay off his rather hefty debts, stealing from her parents often, including over 1,000 francs, which she had already given to Jean Dabin. Violette Nozière was madly in love, but she needed a more rapid influx of money, and her parents were the closest source that she could come up with. And Jean Dabin needed more than 3,000 francs to pay off his gambling debts. The letter found in the apartment was from Violette to Jean Dabin, essentially begging him to ask her father for her hand in marriage, confessing and protesting her love and devotion to him. With all the circumstantial and forensic evidence, Thursday, August 24th of 1933, Violette Nozière was indicted for murder of her father and the attempted murder of her mother. The only problem is, where is she? She fled from Captain Goudet at the hospital. 4 days later, on August 28th of 1933, André Depinguet tells Captain Goudet that he ran into a woman that looks a lot like Violette Nozière, and that she had introduced herself to him as Christian Dafoe. He also told the captain that he was supposed to meet her at 8:30 on a terrace of a brasier called Bière Brune. Without a moment to spare, Captain Goudet rendezvous at 8:30, where he catches Violette Nozière coming out of the metro. Despite being captured, she shows no shock or surprise to authorities, even further proving her guilt. While she was arrested, Captain Goudet had read Violette Nozière her rights and the indictment for murder and attempted murder on both of her parents. He tells her that she has the right to an attorney representation and that she also has the right to waive that and to speak to him and tell him the truth, which she chooses to do. Violette Nozière offers no reason as to why she would do this to her mother, but when it comes to her father, she tells Captain Goudet that her father had been sexually incestuously abusing her from the age of 12 to then 18, and she states this only occurred while her mother was not there. Violette Nozière had officially fully confessed. She also confesses to stealing her parents' savings, which she used to help her lover pay off his gambling debt, but she also went on a very costly shopping spree. The allegation of sexual abuse brought Violette Nozière no sympathy. In fact, it only fanned the flames of the public outrage against her. Not only was it the taboo of talking about incest, but it's this sinister, sordid, and ultimately very sad story that captivated the French. Sensationalism journalism had officially began. Journalists dissected every aspect of Violette's life before the crime, the perceived coddling she had received at home from a mother devoted to her every need, her lies and promiscuity. She told men she was trying to seduce, that her father was a railway executive and that her mother was a head saleswoman at the couture house of Paquin, and her eventual, not terribly successful, forays into prostitution with older, wealthier, right bank businessmen. It's been over 92 years, and Violette Nozière's parricide is still heavily talked about and covered today. Internationally, on October 10th of 1934, 14 months later, her trial officially starts, and none other than her mother, Germaine Nozière, was in attendance. When seeing her mother for the first time in 14 months after being imprisoned, she screamed, "Mommy, Mommy, Maman, Maman." Her mother responds, quote, "What you said about your father is an atrocious lie, but I cannot forget that you are my child," unquote. Violette had to take the stand and give her testimony, and when they asked her questions about her alleged abuse at the hands of her father, she fakes a fainting spell where a court physician has to take her out of the courtroom, put her in another room, and actually give her an injection of a sedative. On day 2 of the trial, Germaine Nozière, Violette's mother, gives her testimony before the court, recounting the horrific details of what their own daughter, Violette, had done to them. And despite vowing to never forgive her and to loathe her, hate her for all of eternity, her mother started to show a lot more sympathy and compassion towards her only child, even going as far as begging, beseeching the judge, the attorneys, the jury, the court, to show mercy to her child in any means necessary, despite the fact that Violette was but a few shy months away from her 20th birthday. After all witnesses and testimonies are given before the court, the jury goes out to deliberate, where they only deliberate for an hour before bringing back their verdict to Judge Lenoir. On October 12th of 1934, Violette Nozière is found guilty on homicide charges of her father and attempted homicide of her mother. She was condemned to death. Violette shows no emotion when the verdict is read, other than anger. She says, quote, "I told you the truth. It is shameful. You are heartless," unquote. Violette Nozière's attorney, Mr. Vazin Leroux, immediately appealed to the court, hoping to overturn the death penalty and save her from the guillotine. Violette Nozière is immediately escorted back to the all-female prison called Roquette. She spends 3 years in Roquette prison being supervised by Sister Leonide. Newspapers and journalists still can't get enough of Violette Nozière, and they continue to follow her journey even when she's imprisoned. In October of 1937, 4 years later, Violette Nozière writes a letter to her mother, officially retracting her accusations of her father's sexual abuse, declaring to her mother that she was trying to save herself, to clear herself by throwing her father under the bus, but Germain forgives her. On December 6th of 1934, a petition was filed for Violette Nozière. On December 25th of 1934, it was approved. Her sentence was officially commuted to forced labor for life. Weeks later, a convoy of 14 women leave Roquette prison to Haguenau prison. Violette is one of them. A sinister, formidable prison. Prisoners are forced to stay silent. They cannot speak to each other, and they have to participate in forced labor, training, and rehabilitation, even against their will. Violette Nozière not only finds God, but she becomes a model prisoner, according to Mr. Vezin Leroux, her attorney, and her mother, Germaine Nozière, which was often making the long travel to go see her daughter. On May 10th of 1940, Violette Nozière is transferred to a prison in Rennes, dans les Ordres. Philippe Pétain, Chief of the State of France, former President of the Council of Ministers of France, reduces Violette Nozière's sentence to only 12 years. On August 6th of 1942, with only 3 years of her sentence left, Violette leaves her job at the laundry inside of the prison and does a training course, being put to work in the prison accounting office, mostly doing work for a Catholic charity and the prison. She meets a very kind gentleman who was the accountant named Eugène Garnier, who was a widow with 5 children. His oldest son, Pierre, was only 23 and became increasingly close to Violette Nozière. Despite being married, Pierre Garnier would divorce his wife and move to be closer to the prison. On August 29th of 1945, prisoner number 9517, Violette Nozière, is freed with Pierre Garnier. The couple leave and return to Paris for a very short time. Violette Nozière's grandfather and most of the town would never forgive her despite being reformed and rehabilitated. On November 15th of 1945, General de Gaulle signs a decree lifting a travel ban that was imposed on Violette Nozière because despite her being a free woman, she was still banned from over 16 regions of France. At age 30, on December 16th of 1946, she and Pierre Garnier officially marry and move to Neuville-sur-Loire. The couple would go on to purchase a hotel and restaurant outside of Rouen, France, and would go on to have 5 children. Violette's mother, Germaine, would live with them and stay with them for the rest of her life. Violette Nozière a eu 5 enfants. The couple's business in Orne was successful for over 10 years when on June 30th of 1961, Pierre Garnier tragically dies in a horrific car accident. Despite being a new widow, Violette successfully manages to raise her 5 children and still run her business. Violette was now going by her middle name, which was Germaine, the same as her mother's, to escape the ridicule and the judgment of the press and her past. Monsieur Vezin Leroux, her lawyer of over 12 years, worked tirelessly to reduce her sentence and was successful in doing so. On March 18th of 1963, Vezin Leroux and a court officially announced Violette Nozière's rehabilitation, and this was the first time this has ever happened in France after somebody was sentenced to death. This was especially a first for any female. Violette Nozière officially had her record expunged. Thanks to the tireless work of Monsieur Vezin Leroux, 3 heads of state studied Violette Nozière's case and exercised their right to pardon, granting her clemency. President Albert Lebrun in 1934, Philippe Pétain in 1942, and Charles de Gaulle in 1945. 2 years after losing her husband Pierre Garnier, Violette was diagnosed with breast cancer. Surgery would successfully remove the breast cancer, and she opened up a new hotel and restaurant, which she ran until 1963. At this time, in 1963, her cancer had returned but had already spread to her bones. Some reports say it was November 26th, others say it was November 28th of 1966 at 2:30 a.m. Violette passes. She is surrounded by her 5 children and her mother, Germaine Nozière. Before she passes, she instructs her oldest daughter, Michelle, to go down to the cellar and to get a green suitcase, of which was full of papers and letters, and to burn them. And she does. The world will never know what was in that suitcase, but we can only guess that it had a lot of evidence from her past. Germaine Nozière continued to live with her 5 grandchildren for 2 more years until her passing on August 4th of 1968. She was 80 years old. Her daughter Violette was only 51 when she passed, and she outlived not only her husband, but her only child. Jean-Baptiste Nozière, Germaine Nozière, Violette Germaine Nozière, and her husband Pierre Garnier are all buried together in Neuville-sur-Loire, Central Paris, France. Despite her parents marrying on August 17th of 1914 when they are 4 months pregnant with Violette, 18 years later, she still would go on to try to take the lives of both of her parents on 2 different occasions. And the presiding judge over Violette's trial opened the proceedings by reminding the jurors that Violette had a, quote, taste for lying, unquote, choosing to ignore over 700 letters that were written from real abuse survivors and artists alike, ignoring the daily headlines for thrill readers and solely looking at objective facts and evidence, to the very dismay and horror of men and parents around France. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason why Violette would do this. The judge and the jury had it correct. Violette Nozière did retract her abuse allegations, and she was lying. Admitting so in October of 1937 in a letter to her mother was just the beginning of her rehabilitation. Or was it? As my dad used to say, there is no such thing as a smart criminal, because a caught criminal is still a criminal. And despite being rehabilitated and reformed and having her official record expunged, Violette Nozière still took the life of her father and attempted to take the life of her mother as well. And nothing can ever change that truth. Violette Nozière had simply committed parricide because she was used to getting her way, getting what she wanted. She was in love and she wanted Jean Devin. She wanted a rich, wealthy, luxurious lifestyle, no matter the cost or the repercussions to other people, including the lives of her own parents. She was simply an entitled, spoiled brat who just wanted her way. And unfortunately for Violette, Jean Devin ended up passing not some years later. In the end, not even being worth taking the lives of her parents for. But yet, she would be the one to have to figure that out. The same way she would have to figure out that she would much rather work on reforming and rehabilitating herself than actually having to spend her life in prison doing forced labor. So was it all a ploy, or was she really in love with Pierre Garnier? Or did she just use him to supplement the lifestyle that she wanted to always have? We will never know, but we do know that parricide crimes are considered exceptionally heinous because they violate the fundamental morale and societal norms by taking one's own parent or parents, and they often involve a history of mental illness, disturbing lies, particularly mental illnesses like personality disorders, oftentimes including that grandiose sense of self and entitlement. Parricides are often committed with undue violence and often result in overkill, indicating a heightened level of rage and disregard for the victims' lives. And this is especially concerning because the victims are the parents, the people who fundamentally gave life to the perpetrator. So was Violette Nozière truly reformed or rehabilitated? Did she have any remorse for what she did, taking her father's life and attempting to take her mother's life? Or was she only sorry after being caught, after being imprisoned, after facing the harsh reality of what happens when you commit those kinds of crimes? We will never truly know the answer or the reason, but we do know that Violette Nozière herself retracted her claims of sexual abuse at the hands of her father, telling the truth eventually. But was it only because that was her only way to get out of prison? Was she really sorry? Was she really remorseful? Had she really found God? We cannot grant acceptance and forgiveness to those who are not willing to accept and to ask for forgiveness. What we do know is that at some point, Germaine Nozière did forgive her daughter. Was she deserving of it? We will never know the answer to that. But what is a fact is that her father did not deserve to die that way, nor did he deserve to have his memory slandered. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.